Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help them be successful. I'm your host, Steve Berg. I'm a partner at a New York City-based venture capital fund called Political Ventures. Season 4 is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Also, please find Intangibles on the web at www.intangiblespodcast.com. At my son's school in Brooklyn, New York, there is a class on critical thinking. It is an international baccalaureate class, which as far as I can tell, means that it is advanced study for high school students. The school values the topic so highly that the headmaster himself teaches the class. Christopher Hitchens, noted atheist, is quoted as saying, "The essence of the independent mind lies not in what it thinks, but how it thinks." I agree, and it sounds like our institutions of learning do too. In order to move our society forward, we need citizens that can not only determine what is salient, but use the data to make good decisions. Critical thinking is the underpinning of that. Dr. Larry Weiss is head of school at Brooklyn Friends. This is his 15th and sadly final year of head of school in a downtown Brooklyn location. In 2004, he became the second head of school at St. Anne's in Brooklyn Heights, and in 2010, he was named head of school at Brooklyn Friends, returning to the place where he began his secondary school teaching career back in 1973. Dr. Weiss graduated from Columbia College in 1971, majoring in Oriental Studies. He subsequently earned his Master of Arts, Master of Philosophy, and Ph.D. degrees at Columbia University's Graduate School of Arts and Science, and a certificate in Chinese Studies from Columbia's East Asian Institute. Dr. Weiss did his dissertation research in Hong Kong on the effects of the Korean War on Chinese political and economic development from 1950 to 1953, and was supported by grants from Social Science Research Council and from the U.S. Department of Health, Education, Welfare, and Fulbright Dissertation Research Program. That's a mouthful. New Yorkers that listen to this podcast will recognize many of the names on the distinguished list of academic institutions that he has helped lead in one form or fashion during his career. A list that includes Friends of World College, Sidwell Friends School in Washington, D.C., Horace Mann School in Riverdale, and, as I mentioned, St. Anne's and multiple stints at Brooklyn Friends. Dr. Weiss and his wife, Wendy Abel Weiss, have been married for 48 years. They have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. And one fun fact that I know is that Dr. Weiss runs the U.S. Marine Corps Marathon every year. If I'm successful today, we'll end up with a primer on critical thinking and a synopsis of the class Dr. Weiss teaches, without, of course, having to worry about the gum stuck to the bottom of the desks. Hello, Dr. Weiss. Thank you very much for coming on and contributing your knowledge on the topic of critical thinking.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Anything that you want to add to that very distinguished bio? For example, how many years in a row now have you run the Marine Corps Marathon?
I've run it 18 times altogether and 13 times in a row.
Wow.
Wow.
And there's something that you have to run 5 times and then you get the automatic invite. Is that right?
Exactly. And those invites are hard to get these days.
I'll tell you that.
And then we'll probably get into the fact that I was a conscientious objector in the military during the Vietnam War and was honorably discharged as a conscientious objector. And running with the Marines gives me a great deal of satisfaction because they really run a race very, very well. And it's great to be part of that.
So, when I ask if anyone wants to add to their bio, no one ever said anything as great as that. That's amazing. All right, I'm going to dive in. Let's talk about how we internalize knowledge, otherwise known as critical thinking. Can you first walk me through the steps?
So I just want to point out first that the reference that you gave in the introduction to the relationship between critical thinking and decision-making is crucial to this particular course that I teach and to my own ideas of what critical thinking is about. First of all, the International Baccalaureate was developed by British and American educators right after the Second World War, and particularly in the 1950s when a lot of the international boarding schools had British Commonwealth students and American students, and the Commonwealth students were preparing for the GCE exams that relate to the A-levels of the British educational system, so where there's essentially a 13th grade. And 12th and 13th grade sets one up for going to Oxford and Cambridge for 3 years as an undergraduate rather than the 4 years. And the Americans were basically looking at advanced placement exams that would get them into the Ivy League schools and the others after a 12th grade program. So the IB ended up being developed as a way to incorporate in 11th and 12th grade, essentially 11th, 12th, and 13th grade order coursework. And the theory of knowledge course that I teach, the epistemology course, has within it the roots of the A-levels approach to the end of high school, being a time that a student can really get a very deep general education focus that normally doesn't happen in American colleges until freshman and sophomore year. So that then the student is ready to concentrate in a field more as a freshman than as a sophomore or junior. And that student has had an opportunity to go deeply into the philosophy of decision-making, into a multicultural examination of the areas of knowledge and particularly ways of knowing.
It just seems so important to have a framework for all of the information that is going to be coming at you at that time. So it seems so nearly obvious that it ought to be taught as a senior, even though it really is, higher end learning, higher end thinking. So I think that's. There's a certain amount of comfort that I get knowing that high school students are getting this.
So, and the one other piece that's really been defining of the International Baccalaureate is that the student writes what's called an extended essay over the course of the second semester of junior year and the first semester of senior year that is on a topic of their choice, that is mentored by a teacher of their choice, that goes through drafts under the supervision of the mentor. So it involves rewriting and sharpening. And that extended essay is then very often presented or referred to in the student's college application.
Right.
And is much closer to the kind of paper that the student's going to have to write 3 or 4 of every semester than a lot of the writing that they do, even in the kind of competitive high school curriculum that the schools you mentioned I've been familiar with. So that combination of individual mentored work and this sort of broad-reaching approach to ways of knowing and areas of knowledge. And the one thing I'd highlight again is that this course tries to go beyond a Eurocentric or a Western-centric approach, both to the ways of knowing and the areas of knowledge.
Yeah.
So, and we'll get into that.
And just so for context, we talked at the beginning of the year, and you'd mentioned that you're teaching it. I don't think I knew that before, although I know you've been teaching for a number of years. Mm-hmm. And you're like, hey, I've got an extra text. Yeah. I'm like, yeah, bring that on. Like, mm-hmm. And I found myself like ripping through this text. It's just so. It's like such a centralized document for these things that are, we probably would find in 60 or 70 different books otherwise. So it's really is really great. Okay. All right. So back to the question, we're talking about the steps that for internalizing knowledge, right? The steps for critical thinking.
Right.
If you give us start with a little primer.
Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, we have the rational deductive model for identifying a particular subject by trying to find out as much about that subject through observation, through research, where we look in a comparative context at how others have looked at that subject, and essentially developing a hypothesis about how one's going to understand a particular subject, and then testing that hypothesis and coming up with a conclusion. And that is the heart of any number of methods in contemporary culture. It's clearly built in to the way that analysis takes place now, even in the machine world, as well as
for sure
in the intellectual world. But what I want to make clear from the beginning is that reason-based way of looking at the world is one way of knowing, and that there are 7 others.
Yeah.
And that emotion, recognizing that a lot of people understand and make decisions on the basis of emotion, and I think we're going to get into that.
Hopefully.
On the basis, and that faith, people do a lot, including killing each other in large numbers.
Yes.
On the basis of faith.
Yes.
That intuition, for many artists, is far more important to them as a way of knowing something than deductive reasoning. And that imagination, as well as intuition, and being very different and having a more of a visual dimension. So the idea is that the thinking process, and more importantly, the decision-making process, you want to try to get a very clear grounding in deductive reasoning.
Absolutely.
But you want to be able to understand that a lot of the things you're trying to understand are in the world because people are doing much more than deductive reasoning.
I'm going to put you to the test on a couple of those other ways of knowing when it comes to it. But so I want to start out.
I will say this: that certainly having Donald Trump as the leader gives us examples of non-rational
ways to talk about things that are being done consciously and not consciously.
Right.
So you're right. There's a treasure trove of examples that we can pull out. So one of the things you said was you're creating a perspective, right? And the thing about a perspective is it's kind of imbibed already with an already. And what I mean by that is it includes what we already believe. It includes what we already know. And I think there's some techniques and tools to bring people to a universal perspective, or at least help line their perspective. Because if I'm coming in with my already and you're coming in with your already, oftentimes there's not common ground. So can we talk a little bit about ways that we, communicate effectively with the already still there?
So, for example, in the areas of knowledge, indigenous knowledge and religious knowledge are considered separate areas of knowing. And the text and the course makes a point of looking at non-Western and Western religions, makes a point of looking at indigenous societies as societies that have existed in essentially the same part of the planet for centuries longer than a lot of the other societies that exist in those areas. So looking at those early on in the course immediately creates a context of saying, okay, we in Brooklyn in 21st century America see the world very much through our own eyes, and especially social media kind of reinforces that. But let's look at things that we might well not understand, not have part of our lives. Where does religious knowledge come from? And for a lot of teenagers, it comes from their parents or even their grandparents. And that immediately sort of engages discussion with them on how do these faith traditions relate to knowledge, and then to morality and to decision making. And similarly, how can we say that indigenous knowledge, which is so non-21st century, has some kind of relevance? And as it happens at Brooklyn Friends, there's a strong curricular involvement with Native American society in third grade and in middle school. And we're regularly visited by members of Native American nations from upstate New York and Canada. And that has been a really great place to start, where you have intuition, you have faith, you have imagination.
You have persistence of memory as well. And then, so
right.
I think I'm getting a picture. The picture is, yes, we have our perspective, but as soon as we put up something against that perspective that is also truth, but it is not the same truth, then we have no choice, if we're rational, but to open up to that other truth.
Right. And what this course is saying is you have no choice, if you're going to take this course, sort of to be...
Nothing like a little brute force.
Well, to being exposed to this.
Yeah.
And even just the exposure to something other than reason as a way of making a decision or a way of analyzing a decision is a big thing.
Yeah, and the notion of having to push back against that if you don't find it in the same way that someone else. I'm gonna try and skin this cat a different way.
Good.
Before I move on. Let's talk about the things with regard to perspective that would actually impede your communication. That would that would close you off from the other truths in the world. That would allow you to make less optimal decisions because you wouldn't possess all the knowledge.
Well, on the one hand, this will probably not be the first time that I say that I believe that the way in which social media is concentrated in the adolescent mind is one that is so self-focused, so focused on the self, where so much of what the self is trying to deal with is critical or hostile commentary from anonymous contributors, makes it even harder for the teenage self to be divorced from an immediate internal focus.
Well, I think that there's a universality to that. I do not think that high school teenagers are immune, frankly. I mean, the creation of social media is really the development of echo chambers, right?
Yes.
It's a place to find people who already think exactly like you and hear yourself being, viciously or virtuously, however you choose to think, reinforced.
Yes, so that's the answer to your question is that is the hardest thing to break through in a class. But in the 5 years that I've done this class, it has not taken very long for people to see, let's move that aside. And let's really see how we can look through different kinds of mirrors of ways of knowing and areas of knowledge in a non-judgmental and growth mindset kind of way.
Yeah, I think you can also show weaknesses or inconsistencies or incompleteness in process of validation as well, right? Because you're validating a thing, and if you go, well, you're not validating it in all the ways that you could be validating it, and as long as you are still kind of self-aware enough to know that what you're hearing is correct, you can go, aha, I have not.
Especially if you're not being graded and not being tested in the sort of, unfortunately, increasingly universal high school method where there's a right answer.
Right.
What I'm looking for and what I've found in my students over those years is that I'm much more interested in how they approach decision-making.
That's back to the Hitchens quote, right?
On the basis of this.
That's back to the Hitchens quote. And it probably must blow their mind, right? Because there's always been a right answer, and you get the right answer, and you get a check.
Right.
So all of a sudden, there's not necessarily a right answer, and it can still be good.
Which I should just say, in terms of relativism, in its scientific role, and science is looked at in this course, both in terms of what's called the natural sciences, and that's more of a British way of looking at it, that includes biology, chemistry, and physics, and the human sciences, which are all of the social sciences, which are very rarely taught in a high school context at all. They are more in Britain. But what's great is to be able to say, okay, a historian might see something this way, But this is what an anthropologist looks for when they're looking at decision making or they're looking at truth. And this is what a sociologist and, the next time you're at the Museum of Natural History, be able to sort of see how, whether it's religious artifacts or art, how that all incorporates these different ways of knowing.
So you did something right there that allows me to take a small detour, a small segue, and it's to talk about truth.
Yes.
Right? And in critical thinking, this is a question, genuinely. In critical thinking, does truth need to be absolute? I mean, I think you're saying no.
Right.
Which that runs counter to what the Gen Pop wants to say, right?
Sure.
There's not the truthiness is no longer any good, and facts are no longer Let's talk about that.
So I think with adolescence, there's a great opportunity for the adolescent to develop her or his individual truth.
I think you're selling short adolescence. I think it can be the great opportunity for anybody.
Well, it is, but I think in developmental terms, if an adolescent is not getting clearer about her or his perception of what is true and what is real, I think that's a disadvantage for that person. And I think all too much formal education is based on accepting someone else's truth and internalizing it rather than saying, okay, what is my truth? And not saying, okay, well, you think it and therefore it's right, but more being then, what are the roots of your truth? What are the things that you want to know more about? And how do you judge the decisions that you're making on the basis of the truths that you are evolving? And what are some better ways or better outcomes that you're looking for from your decisions? And is it better to try to take into account how much of your truth is based on emotion or intuition, and how much of it is based on reason and sensory perception and memory? And how does your truth stack up against the other truths that your fellow students are expressing and the truths that the philosophers and the psychoanalysts and the historians are giving you in your courses?
By the way, in the world that I envision that's coming, those folks that just kind of blindly memorize facts as truth, they're going to be hugely disadvantaged.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
All right, so you talked about this in kind of stepping me back at the intro, but there's 8 ways of knowing,
yes.
And I'm going to just list them and let you nod your head instead of causing you to repeat
Good.
them. Language, reason,
Yep.
perception,
Yep.
emotion, faith, intuition, imagination, and memory.
Yes.
These are them. Okay. I don't know if we're going to be able to do all of these right now.
Yeah.
I'm going to do I'm going to dive in deeper in some and kind of
Right.
give a cursory on other ones.
Yeah.
So, all right. I think I want to start with reasoning. Let's start by contrasting objective versus subjective reasoning.
Right.
Right. Certainly, I don't know if I'm right or not, but I feel like that is a base tool that you have to have in your toolbox to begin critical thinking.
Okay, and I would agree with that. So let me just tell you about an assignment I just gave to my class last week. And we were looking at the dyad of ethics as an area of knowledge and reason as a way of knowing. So I asked them to do a 2 or 3 page paper that first of all identified an ethical decision that they had made in the last week or two. And then to subject that ethical decision to the analytical method of reason, which is
subjective.
Well, that their judgment about their ethical decision was subjective, but what's objective is looking at it in terms of what's your hypothesis about how this decision was made.
How did you go about testing it?
How can you now test it in terms of whether it initially had the intent that you wanted it to have and the impact that you wanted it to have. And this is something I think that, particularly for adolescents, but everyone, gets into a lot of trouble when they make a decision and that decision is criticized or felt as wrong or painful by someone. And the classical default is, oh, well, I didn't mean to do that. I didn't mean to upset you. I didn't mean to imply collusion with the Russians by saying that Vladimir Putin would have a $50 million penthouse in the Trump Tower in Moscow. My intent was just to improve the relationship between Russia and the United States. But what is the impact? What is the conclusion of your rational analysis of your decision, particularly with the emphasis on the impact? So you're taking something subjective, you are subjecting it then to a more objective analysis. And doing that exercise, I think, gets you aware of how important both elements of subjective and objective are.
So Kahneman, right? I know you're a devotee or at least a student of Kahneman. He wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow, right? And that talks about one system of our brain, which is he creatively called System 1, right? Which uses kind of pattern recognition, intuition to reach conclusions quickly. It's kind of like your shorthand, right? And
so let me just stop you on there,
okay.
Because when I teach this course, I really try to be as historically developmental as possible. So those kinds of factors are very involved in survival.
Sure.
Being able to react to danger quickly, being able to take life-saving steps. And so when we start off looking at indigenous cultures, those are survival skills that tend to be incorporated in the ways of knowing around that and trusting yourself to be able to do those things. But at the same time, in many of the indigenous cultures as well, there's the idea of meditation, of understanding the great spirit, of trying to maintain harmony within the group. So, and whether it's the id and the libido, all these other different things, the fast brain is the brain that keeps us alive.
Right.
And the slow brain...
Or certainly had,
Right.
And still has a purpose, right?
Yeah.
And you've been prescient here because I think you've gotten to the heart of my question before I was fully able to ask it. But let me see if I can wriggle some details out of you, right? So, all right. So Kahneman's got the one system which, like you said, it's kind of like what Watson does in Sherlock Holmes, right? Like he just, kind of uses what he's relied on in the past to kind of get there quickly, and then, then Sherlock Holmes comes in and he uses system 2, and that's the deduction, and that's much more deliberate and takes a longer time period. He removes things that, situations and obstacles that can't be there. So as you mentioned, I think both systems are useful. Why don't we do it this way? Why don't we do a little more color and explain kind of an optimal situation where each form of thinking actually makes the most sense, right? Because you're saying, hey, look, we used to survive that way. Probably don't have as many tigers chasing us through the streets of Brooklyn as we used to, but certainly still valuable, right?
Still a lot of chasing going on.
Yeah,
but yes.
So I kind of put you on the spot there, but if you can think of any.
Well, I would go back to Sherlock Holmes and say, at least the way that Sherlock Holmes has been shown in some of the more contemporary films and TV series on PBS and things, that the intuitive dimension of Holmes is always important in terms of, all of the analysis that he's got going on.
Creating scenarios by which he can eliminate.
Right. But he's always sort of shaping it in terms of narrowing down where the possibilities might be. And so I would say that that's a classic example of the analytical and the rational.
Right.
At the same time, when you see the clues that he picks up, very often they're involving misstatements of memory that might have seemed accidental to someone else, but he puts together a theory where it was really an intentional memory.
Sometimes,
lapse,
yes, sometimes. So, and these are fallacies, right? These are So let's
Right.
talk about you're giving again.
Yeah.
You're like a step in front of me the entire way
Okay.
here. So, which is great. So there are fallacies in this in reasoning, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to pick just 3 because otherwise we'll be here
That's
a long,
fine.
long time,
Right.
right? Argument from ignorance is one of them,
Right.
Right, where literally you just don't know.
Or I would also say argument for the sake of argument.
Yeah, that happens very frequently.
Because you're expected to argue even if you're ignorant. Whereas it's much easier, ultimately, I think, to say, I really don't know enough about this. And we can talk about our impressions, but let's both try to get more into the weeds.
Yes. The goodness of that hack, though, is if you can make people think it's okay to say, I don't know. Yeah. It's okay to not argue about this. It's okay to give on this point. That is the quick solution to the fallacy.
Right. And for an adolescent, I think in particular, to say to a hypothetical someone, you are pressuring me to make a decision, which might involve inhaling a particular substance or involving an interpersonal sexual relationship
Not
or whatever.
Friends, are you kidding me? I'm abhorred.
Exactly. To be able to say, I don't know enough about you yet. Yeah. I don't know enough about me yet.
Yeah.
Let's just keep talking or keep relating.
Yeah.
But I don't feel I am in fact ignorant about who you really are, and to a certain degree, who I really am. So if we're going to have a relationship, let's try to know a little more about each other.
Let's go through a fact-finding mission.
Well, and an emotion finding.
For sure. For sure. All right, next one I'm picking is hasty generalization.
Right.
Explain that a little bit, and then maybe just a quick example from what you would teach your kids.
Sure. I mean, well, you really see it a lot in lower school kids and middle and upper school kids, where they've heard a fact, they've memorized a fact, they have gotten a check mark on their test, and inevitably that puts it into a higher category of their own understanding, and may lead them to make a generalization that no teacher has ever suggested, no book has ever suggested, but it just makes logical sense that, my dog did this this morning, and I think the reason that the dog did it was that, I used these words or I gave this treat or whatever, and so if someone could use these words and give a treat to me, I would learn something faster than that.
Yes.
Whatever.
Certainly a hasty generalization.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to choose the final one again because I know we would go on and on and on. Black and white thinking.
Yeah.
Right?
Which, unfortunately, again, I think is reinforced by standardized testing and by social media.
Right.
There was a story in the New York Times today, I don't know if you read it, about this school that got Ivy League admissions from kids from Louisiana, where the whole school curriculum was based on the ACT test.
Teaching to the ACTs.
Well, not only teaching to it, but just giving it to the kids over and over and over again. And the kids got into Harvard, the kids got into all of these places.
Right.
And then it just turned out that if there was a subject that wasn't on the ACT that was part of their course curriculum, they had no idea of what it was.
They showed up with only a hammer in their toolbox, and when they needed a screwdriver, no screwdriver to be found.
And so, that standardized testing piece is really difficult. And then on the social media piece, it's not so much whether you get the right answer, it's whether someone likes your answer. And how many people like my answer? How many friends do I have in response to this thing that I said or this picture that I posted?
And look, the generalization that I have here, just so far in the conversation, is the value of the class, and the ideal to you is, how do we build the best human being that we can, right? How do we build the best person? And that person doesn't have to be an ace in physics. They don't have to be but they just have to be a person that can navigate the world and be able to make relative sense of it.
Right, and I think to get back to your primary subject of critical thinking, people who are comfortable with a thinking process that goes deeper, takes more time, and leads to more conscious results, while also realizing that there are unconscious and subconscious things that are shaping them, and that they can integrate all of that into a personality that they're comfortable
So
with.
here's a kind of a subtopic that I really, really wanted to get to, because sometimes, people commit those fallacies in ignorance. They just don't realize they're doing it. But sometimes they actually do it on purpose. And I think that's essentially disinformation, right? And I think we see that.
Or fake news.
Well, that's where I was going with this.
Right.
I think we see that when we have pundits, right, who are there to defend a thing and have to carry the water for an ism of some kind, right? How do you teach your kids to deal with it when it's, oh, that person just made an error, versus, oh, that person's trying to fool me?
Yeah. Or that person's evil.
Right. And they're genuinely out for their own interest, and they don't really care how
and that person should die, or
okay, all right,
whatever.
All right.
So, or the country that person comes from should die.
Right.
And that's, again, at the heart of your critical thinking is to help students trust their own ability to think in nuance, to always be curious about other ways of looking at something, to be rewarded when they are coming up with their own analysis that is different than even the mainstream of the class.
And when that spidey sense says, something's wrong here, what are they supposed to do?
Say that.
Just call it out.
Yeah, just say, I mean, the most polite way of saying it in the class is to say, I'm just thinking something that seems to be inconsistent with what we just said.
So you labelize it to minimize it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, I not to minimize it so much as more to be specific about it.
Right. Like, you're doing this.
Uh-huh.
That is why that counts for less in my mind in terms of my critical thinking process.
Yeah. Or let's both go deeper into this.
I don't know if I want to chase someone down a rabbit hole when I think they're lying to me.
Well, with adolescents, if you don't, then you basically have lost the game.
Understand.
You have to trust them to go with you, because they don't think of it as a rabbit hole. They think of it in many ways as getting out of a trap.
Yeah.
That they can then say, well, you don't care what I think anyway, so I'm going to turn off
Throw
to
my
you.
hands.
And be passive, and make sure that if stuff is going to be on the exam, that I pay attention to that. But no, I think with adolescents and adults, and I think we're doing some of that in this conversation, that even if something is said that you disagree with, if you can go deeper into it to understand what the other person is saying in a non-pejorative kind of way.
If you have a genuine interest in doing that,
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to language. I think language is such an interesting part of this, because language, it can at once sharpen an argument, or in the very same way weaken an argument. Is language the most important element in critical thinking?
I think what's most important in critical thinking is to understand that someone else's language, even if it's the same, outward language, is not going to necessarily be the same as yours. So the question, what do you mean by that, is really important, because there is more unity around what meaning means than what a lot of the words that go into a statement or a question. And I think in general, people are respectful of being asked that question and feel in some ways some positive reinforcement when you care enough about what they're saying to say, now, I think I know what you mean by that, but can you give me a little more detail on what you mean by that?
Well, in the world right now, there are people who make a lot of money by picking their words very carefully.
Yeah.
So, I think I do think it is important, but I also do think being able to recognize that either sharpness or weakness, depending on.
So let me just tell you, in the text, language is there. In one section of it, to talk about the difference between oral language and written language and the evolution of written language and the idea that written language has some sort of higher value than spoken language, and the idea that one is necessarily more rational or more worthy of being taken seriously can be challenged. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I read it off a paper. It must be true.
Yes.
No.
Particularly, or I read it off a screen.
Right.
And that means it's even more true.
Right. All right. So there's language fallacies, just like there are fallacies in other ways.
But in a multicultural context, also, when you realize that even in their structures, many languages are different than each other.
Yes.
Just in terms of how a subject is approached and how verbs are conjugated or not conjugated, or how things are made more collective rather than more specific. And I think, again, for high school kids to sort of see that, especially kids who are studying other languages to some degree, prepares them for a world in which there are so many different voices, and you think the person is saying something to you that they might not intend to say, or that has an impact on you that suddenly puts them in a different category, particularly negative and pejorative, when that person was using the word not necessarily with that intent.
So let's highlight, if you would, a couple of the language fallacies. Could you give me one or two?
Actually, maybe you give me an example of one that you would see as particularly significant from your point of view.
I don't have any ones that I would highlight, because my view of them was almost universally they're the same thing. So when I studied it and I looked at it, I'm like, oh, that's the same thing, kind of regurgitated, recombined. And so I was kind of hoping to draw out from you. If not, we can just pass on.
No, I mean, because it's actually, when I talked about the dyad of ethics and reason, the first dyad that this year's class started off with was indigenous knowledge and language, and that so much of indigenous knowledge is based on an oral tradition, and that as writing develops, initially I think just to count things, and as writing also develops, particularly in Chinese and other languages, out of visual representation, out of pictures that then become more abstract. The fallacy is essentially, I think, to hear a word, think you know what it means, and not to try to get some kind of clarification or at least imagination about what else it might have meant.
To go Holmes on it, to shortcut it, right? Just
exactly.
in your head. I also think, we just did touch on one, which is that a sense, whatever the form of media assigns a different kind of value in your head. So I think that's one as well.
But this might not fit your category, but it really becomes central to a lot of particularly an adolescent way of looking at theories of knowledge, is this gap between intent and impact.
Right.
And the intent, which is subjectively formulated, and the impact, which is a lot harder to try to think about before you say something. Yeah. And I think, although I find it very difficult to say anything positive about Trump, I think the fact that so many people are justifiably critical about the impact of his words without necessarily crediting the fact that he might have had a very different intent, but he has no control and no ability to sort of think about what the impact is before he says it, and how much of this was an intentional impact and how much of it was just reactiveness.
Premeditated versus verbal diarrhea.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Let's move on and discuss perception. This refers to the information that our senses provide us.
Right.
A great deal of good critical thinking is, really being aware and avoiding the tricks that our senses are actually playing on us, right? All right. So when humans perceive something to be true, they often take the shortcuts and they'll rely, like we talked about, on past experiences, and they create expectation, and then they just look for confirmation. They just look for things that take what they already thought and prove them to be true. The thing is, if we're not really careful about that, we just fool ourselves into perceiving something when another thing is in fact true, right? So, and that is, in fact, in my mind, that is the opposite of critical reasoning, right? So that's a pitfall. So the question is, what's the reason that humans create these expectations? And should they really try to suspend those expectations?
So suspending would be one way, because I think your analysis is right of what happens. But if either as part of suspending or in addition to suspending, or even instead of suspending, you can say to the person or to others, what did you see?
Yeah.
Okay, I think I saw this. What did you see? I thought I heard this, and it has this meaning to me, but how do you see it? Not that how you see it is definitely going to be better than how I see it,
Right.
but the more open you are to getting multiple perspectives on something, especially across cultures and across, other predetermined, mutually exclusive variables of age, gender, race, whatever. And is there a way that we can hear each other's perceptions of the same thing?
I think we're talking about disentangling an observation from an interpretation, right? And the way you do that is by getting other interpretations and see if they mesh.
Without assuming that yours is right just because you saw it that way.
Right. And by the way, that's hard. But I think you just gave the answer, and the answer is the way to do that as a critical thinker is just to not assume automatically that you're right.
Yeah,
right?
And that takes the verb critical, or to criticize, to yourself to say, wait a minute, did I actually see what I thought I saw?
Yes.
Did I actually hear this person say what I thought she said?
That's exactly right.
And that's hard. Because what are teachers and parents always saying? Listen to me. Do what I tell you.
Yes.
Get this answer and see it my way, or you're on the highway. And
so I want to ask you, I've struggled with the concept of intellectual honesty, not what it is broadly, but how intellectual honest I am with myself, right? This sounds like intellectual honesty.
Yeah. That if it gets incorporated early enough becomes more reflexive.
Yeah.
Which is to say, I'm comfortable with saying to someone, I'm hearing you say this. Is that really what you're saying? Yeah.
And I don't necessarily mind being wrong on this if you can abuse me of why I'm wrong.
Yeah, or it's not even whether it's right or wrong. How much more can I understand about this from getting your point of view of it?
Yeah.
And, we're both reading the same book. I'm telling you what I think the author is saying, but I really want to know what you think. And if it's different than what I think, that's even better.
Right. And by the way, it could also be the same. It could be two different things and both be true.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So again, I know that we could keep talking, but I've got to keep moving. So
Okay.
I'm moving on to another way of knowing, and that's memory.
Right.
So I think memory, similar to other ways of knowing, it can be a little sketchy as well, right? I mean, you can't always trust your memory. There's things, there's memory decay, memory distortion.
So
there's a ton of biases.
You're talking to someone who'll be 70 in July, and the reality of what you're saying is all the more prescient.
There is, just for people who don't know, Malcolm Gladwell, or Malcolm Gladwell, right? So he's got this podcast now, and he literally did a 2-part episode on the decay of memory. And this one particular guy was going around telling the story and didn't have any really reason to lie, but when you went back and checked the truth, it wasn't anything like that, and that it was literally just this kind of his mind playing a trick on him, because it made the most sense. All right, so let's talk about, I know we keep coming back to these biases, but I feel like if we talk about the reasons that you can get tripped up, I think people broadly understand the concept, but if you identify it and stop yourself from getting tripped up, you're tightening your critical reasoning skills. So that's why I'm doing it, by the way.
Yeah,
all right. So, So if we go back to our critical thinking process, should we assign less value to memory because it's fallible, or do we do something else to try and bring it up in terms of the quality of the facts that we're weighing for reason?
Okay, so this is the thing. If we're looking at criminal justice, if we're looking at writing history,
I knew you would do the answer to this. I knew you would do it.
Then assuming that there actually was a fact, is it written down? Is it written down in enough similarity by several different people who saw it from different perspectives? Yeah. Is there firsthand evidence that someone gave verbally to someone else, not being coerced, or sort of more objectively? And and this is where my own training as a historian or political scientist comes in, where it became absolute gospel that if you were going to do research, you really had to try deliberately to look for alternative sources, and then try to figure out a rational explanation of how they might both have been talking about the same thing.
So you have to open it up to the external world. Is there any, I know, and that makes perfect sense. What happens, is there any, there probably isn't. If you can't, right? If it's a memory of one, if you're the only person to have it.
I think that some of the books on these shelves are memories of one, and if it's understood on that basis, and if it's the memory of Sigmund Freud or the memory of Albert Einstein or Erik Erikson, it's just really great to be able to see their mind process without necessarily having a dogmatic or religious attachment to that one particular view.
I think you're saying you just got to be careful about that, right? If you're at all concerned that the memory has some fault in it, then you have to weigh it less. Right. Yeah. All right. So look, I can tell the ones that you like to talk about. In the interest of time, I'm going to leave
the ones that you think I might not want to.
I'm gonna leave out imagination and emotion.
Okay.
I'm kind of just to the tangential references we've got.
But they're really great with adolescents. That's the last thing I'll say. It's very affirming.
It's so clear that you have kind of strong bodies of knowledge or understanding, wisdom to impart on emotion and faith.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go for emotion and faith. And Steve, here's 4. Which 2 would you take? I'm taking these 2. Okay. So I'm going to go with emotion. And again, if you think memory is a little sketch, this is where the water really starts to get murky, right? Right. Is there room for emotion in critical thinking?
There has to be. And I think to some degree, the Buddhist and the meditative emphasis that's even in Quakerism would say that meditation can be a process of calming the emotion and trying to open up a less emotional enlightenment on something, but none of the meditation-based faiths, I think, would say do away with emotion, try to suppress emotion. Everybody's got to realize, again, that this is what we're hardwired as animals. And one of the things at the beginning of this course is to start off saying we have evolved from animals. We are very much animals. Animals don't write things down. Animals don't plant food and harvest it. These are all things that we've developed for survival. But animals definitely have emotion, and we do too. So, again, I think when I mentioned Erikson, I think more than Freud and sort of more than the Freudians in general, Erikson is saying, how do different emotions evolve? How does an adult approach to an emotional issue differ from a child's approach?
Yeah.
But the idea is that those emotions are just as powerful.
I got to tell you, man, this is the hardest one for me, because in my opinion, not always, but in certain situations, emotion is in fact in opposition to reason.
Oh, it absolutely is. And I'm not saying that it isn't. I'm just saying that it's there. I mean, I read recently a book that was suggested by Michiko Kakutani in her last book review that was on the front page of the Times about the rise of Hitler, okay? And it, from my point of view, was intended to be prophetic about our current leadership, but basically looked at how Hitler and particularly Goebbels were able to understand the power of emotion and manipulate that emotion into anger and
ultimately action, right? So emotion overcame reason often.
Right. And that was seen as a good thing, as a Germanic thing,
as an effective
as a
tool.
Wagnerian thing.
Yeah.
And, and horrible consequences arose.
So I'm going to make the pro case then. Mm-hmm. Right, having just said that it's impossible for me in instances. All right, so Machiavelli, right? Machiavelli says everything is done out of either love or fear. In that scenario, it seems like emotion is the only propulsive force, right? The question is emotion like fear, is that just a tool, like we were implying, or is it a pitfall, or is it sometimes one and sometimes the other?
I think it's both, but I think the problem with Machiavelli, and I remember that, the Columbia humanities curriculum, the undergraduate curriculum, did not have us read The Prince. It was another book which my memory is now blocking, which was much more based on rationality. And I'll might remember
Come
it later.
sometime. If you don't, that's fine.
But Machiavelli, I think, was in The Prince saying, if I'm writing to someone who is totally devoted to manipulating people and to taking their money and to killing their enemies, definitely it's emotion that's going to get them to do those things. Yeah,
this is the other side of the coin. Remember, we just talked about the notion of somebody, creating a fallacy on purpose to create disinformation.
Right.
This is an equal tool in that same toolbox of saying, hey, I can manipulate someone into doing someone. All right, so look, the goodness of this, and you've helped me get there, is that these are just tools in the toolbox, right? They're not.
But again, let's get back to critical thinking.
Yes.
Is that if you can say, I recognize emotion as a way of knowing, I recognize faith as a way of knowing, but for me to really be able to make good decisions, I have to be able to balance my emotional impulse with my more rational impulse, with my intuitive that's where it's going in terms of balance, which I was actually, when I was reading your original questions, led back to thinking about the role of faith in a central decision of my life, which was being a relatively safe member of the military with having had a very low number in the draft lottery. I joined the Medical Reserve Unit and went through basic combat training and combat medic training in 1970-71 in what would have been the first semester of my senior year. And then I decided at a particular point I had made a mistake, that if I ended up having to go to jail for my beliefs that it's wrong to kill people, I was ready to do that. But within the system, it turned out that there was a conscientious objector option in the military. And my medic training was at Fort Sam Houston, which is the center in San Antonio of the whole medical corps. And it happened to have a really good library. And in that library, there was a book by Abraham Heschel. And I was brought up as a Jew, and I still believe that I am a Jew. But I had never read Heschel before. And this was a book called Between God and Man, which, Heschel is the guy who was carrying the Torah in Selma across the Pettus Bridge with Martin Luther King. He was a very major force in a Jewish theological seminary. But he's basically saying, between God and humans is this space, is this metaphysical space that creates the opportunity for understanding what one can understand and what goes beyond one's understanding, and figuring out words and feelings that might incorporate that. And if the words that have come down in the commandments and the commentaries and all of this are meaning something to you in a particular way, trust that as a real statement of your values, even though it might not be written in a way that says, as Quakerism would be explicit in saying there's that of God in every person. But Heschel is basically saying that's exactly what it is. There is that of God in every person, and recognize your frailty and recognize your own vision. Yeah. And so there was something where you said, I think that maybe faith is not part of critical thinking. But in this particular case for me, I then had to embark on critical thinking to analyze what it was that led me to sign a 6-year contract and to think that being a medic was okay, especially if I didn't have to go to Vietnam. Yeah. And I said, well, if I thought that way, I was really violating my deeper.
So I'm going to test you on faith in just a second, at least a couple of things. But I'm going to finish up on emotion, and I'm still on the pro case. Mm-hmm. And the other emotion that comes to mind specifically for me is empathy.
Good.
And so if I think of what empathy means the capacity to stand imaginatively in someone else's shoes.
I would say to think imaginatively in someone's head, but...
Yes. This seems absolutely critical to critical thinking, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, can you learn empathy so that you can do this?
See, I think
that you can increase your ability to
I think if you go over what we've said in the last hour or so, in virtually every dimension that you've mentioned, there's been, how do you connect with the other person in a way that's not threatening and gives them a chance to disagree with you or to engage with you? And that, to me, is the heart of empathy. And if you can do that in a way that is as possibly devoid as it can be of superiority and inferiority judgments on the basis of age or gender or race or whatever, and say, I want really to understand how you see this.
Genuinely.
Yes, genuinely. And I will tell you genuinely how we see this. And we will probably disagree. But I'm not going to grade you on yours, and I hope you're not going to grade me on mine if this is part of an ongoing dialogue. That is, The Discourses is the other Machiavelli book. Yeah. The Discourses is far more based on rationality.
So he was balanced in his own way too.
Well, he knew he had different clients, and the prince was based on his client as a prince.
A tough crowd.
And the Discourses were based on other philosophers and statespeople.
Okay, here we go. Are you ready? This is the tough one. This is the black box of ways of knowing. We're going to go with faith now, right? I know we can't do it justice in a couple of minutes, but let's try, right? Let's start with this one that I feel is a little heavier. It feels to me as though people are genetically predisposed to faith being either valid or invalid in their critical thinking, right? There's a group of people that somehow possess the capacity to have faith, and they stand in abject opposite to people who are like, no, I just cannot believe. If I can't see it, if I can't feel it, if I can't touch it, I can't know it.
Okay, so let's look at how people develop faith. If faith is essentially indoctrinated from adult to child, especially in a situation in which if you even as a child challenge the faith, you are punished or exorcised or cast out, that's true. What your analysis is true. Certainty, anything that is questioning, anything that's uncertain is seen as apostate, is seen as heresy. But I think most faith traditions have a recognition that at a certain point, whatever one's familiarity or punishment or whatever has been as a child, that if you don't own the faith in some way that is personally meaningful to you, it's not going to play a positive part in your life.
In all the years of teaching the course, have you ever seen a student in the course of the semester learn to believe?
I can't say that I have, because I've never really even tried to make that kind of value judgment. Yeah. I will say that the most important thing for me in this kind of course and in this kind of career is to see students who did not believe in themselves as 8th or 9th graders end up believing more in themselves, and that self-belief to some degree has been informed by the things that they've learned about other belief systems, and maybe more so the one that they inherited. And then because this is a religious school, not outwardly wearing it on its sleeve, but definitely having it in its name, there have definitely been students that I've seen who had really no idea and no particular interest or even hostility in a lot of the Quaker values. Yeah. Still graduating not 100%. I don't know that anyone is 100% for any value system. But seeing that this did play a role in how they were ready to resolve conflicts. It did play a role in how their friendly relationships were able to sustain.
I believe I've seen people where there's a microcosm of it, and you could see it extrapolated into them over time. But I think it's a tough thing to see.
And then, if you look at our generation, and maybe I'm being presumptive because we got, I think, 3 different generations here, but the impact of the non-secular, not only on our larger worlds, but on our friends and acquaintances. I mean, the older I get, the more surprised I am that people that I went to high school with, and we sort of stay in touch a pretty good amount, have ended up with religious commitments and faith commitments that are entirely different than one might have expected.
Oh, well, I thought you were going to say that they've become, as they've gotten closer to the end, they've become, faith has been a more tangible thing.
Well, there's that, and I inevitably look at that perspective.
Yeah.
I'm thinking more even about 10, 20, 30 years ago.
All right, I'm going to let you have to for that one. Okay, so this is the other side of belief. And again, we're kind of like weaponizing a couple of these things, right? And I don't want to, but I want to be aware of that, right? So there's a rock and roll album. YouTube is a band, and they put out an album. And in that album, there's a lyric which specifically says, "The worst things in the world are justified by belief." And I assume that they're referring to are things like holy wars, anti-Semitism, bigotry, things that we've kind of touched on a little bit here. But I think before we can make a pro-faith case, we need to talk about how faith can kind of take us off the rails.
Sure. But before we do that, could you in any way accept the idea that the best things are also justified by faith? That your higher values and your, compassion and empathy and all of that there are faith traditions, many of them non-Western, that emphasize empathy and faith. Mm-hmm. Now, those traditions have involved people killing each other.
I'm just going to answer that question,
yes.
Yeah. I'm just going to say I can also see that.
Right.
I don't know if I necessarily radiate that, but I certainly can see it and acknowledge it.
Yeah. So faith becomes one of those things that you can make intuitive and rational and emotional judgments about. Yeah. And you can also, and this is where I think the fundamental problem is in American society, you can treat in a rational and compassionate way someone whose faith system, as you understand it, is entirely opposed to yours.
Yes.
And
mutually exclusive.
And in the past, put yours in ovens. But is there still some kind of common ground before it gets to that level of dehumanization where you can honor their faith in some way? And particularly with Christianity, there are so many different positive, humane, and Martin Luther King, was so fantastic with that, is there some way of bridging the gap? Yeah. And at the same time, this gets into slightly muddy territory. I have, for a variety of reasons, a lot of problems with ultra-Orthodox Judaism, and the idea that my version of Judaism has very much at all in common with the ultra-Orthodox tradition. Right. And then if I am stereotyped, I'm stereotyped on the basis of stereotypes of the ultra-Orthodox, and particularly the way they act in Israel is problematic. But at the same time, I know that when I have sat down and talked to Hasidim who are ready to have a conversation, that there is some ground of agreement before we get off.
It broadly
is.
I think isolationism broadly is something right now everyone's really grappling with. Yeah. So, all right, so let's do the pro case, because you're pretty strong on the pro case here. I'm going to say that the pro case is that faith is kind of like any other sense that we've got. And it's just more difficult to put a precise definition to it, right? We see, we hear, we smell. We know exactly what those things are. We believe. Yeah. It's just harder to say what specifically that is. Yeah. All right, I'm also going to say, making the pro case for faith, that we make predictions, right? We extrapolate things into the future. It's not all, faith is not all that dissimilar to predictions and extrapolating things into the future. And one would argue broadly that those things, extrapolating, that those things are in fact part of critical thinking.
Right. And religion has the ace, the trump card with a small t, which is when you say, well, you said this was going to happen and it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
Religion is always to say, wait, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
I have faith that it's going to happen.
Right.
And, it's hard rationally to defeat that, except to say definitively it hasn't happened yet. So,
and by the way,
let's see
sometimes
what
faith
happens.
can create a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Oh,
Just believing
very
that
often.
believing that you can is what
Right.
kind of wills it into existence. All right, final series of questions.
Okay.
We've got all our ways of knowing, well, except for two, which we.
All
But
right.
this is a series of questions that try and puts all the elements together.
Good.
So, all right, I know all my ways of knowing. I know my pitfalls. I know my biases, or at least some of them. We've talked about them. All right, now I'm about to engage in a critical thinking process.
Right.
What do I actually do?
Okay. So, first, you're going to come up with some kind of working hypothesis. You're going to come up with some areas of research in terms of where you're going to find out. But you've continually got in the back of your mind, are there inherent biases in my hypothesis?
Right.
Have other people made different kinds of hypotheses on the same subject? So before I start looking at evidence and conflicting evidence, should I at least pay some attention to alternative hypotheses that have been put forward?
Yeah.
Okay.
System 2.
Right. And then, if I'm going to look at different sources, have I gone out of my way to see where other analysts have made it clear that there are 3 or 4 different major schools of looking at this, some of which are so obnoxious that it might be hard even to give them some credit.
In order to say that you've
Yes,
been
I want to
thorough
be
and
able
thoughtful.
to try to understand them, or at least see where their data came from, and whether it was inherently false or true but not necessarily accurately interpreted.
Okay.
And then when I bring together my research and I'm looking for a central theme for my analysis that derives from my hypothesis, am I as careful as I can be, particularly on the deductive side?
And also waiting.
Right.
On waiting.
To make an argument that doesn't get lost in all the exceptions and that doesn't get lost in the inherent need to, if not prove, present a strong case for X, Y, Z.
Create a reasonably valid conclusion.
Right.
Got it.
And it then, is that conclusion as clearly related to my hypothesis as it can be? Is it as concisely and clearly stated? And in some ways, I think I'm a real believer in good writing as rewriting. When I take, that first draft, can I make my conclusion into my introductory paragraph?
Right. Yeah, there's a great American Express commercial right now with Juan Manuel Miranda. Lin-Manuel Miranda, where he's like, don't believe your first draft. Yes. Don't believe your 10th draft, right? Like he don't be satisfied with that. Keep refining and keep, getting to the essence of what it is.
So my daughter was 1 year behind him at Wesleyan and was in some of his plays that he wrote as an undergraduate. And, we just did In the Heights.
Yes.
And there's such brilliance there.
Yes.
And yes, that was so clearly a polished product that then Hamilton, I think, is one of the most ultimately polished.
So I'm giving you the well done on defining the critical thinking process for us. And now I'm going to ask a slightly harder, and we're literally the second to last question here. All right, I've done this. I've done my critical thinking.
Right.
How do I know that I've made a better decision? What do I do to go, yep, critical thinking worked for me?
Okay, I think fundamentally, what are the results of the decision? What is the impact of the decision? And you might say, gee, I thought I did a really good job, but no one understood what I was trying to do. And in fact, they misunderstood what I was trying to do.
Can you measure this thing?
As the chief executive of an academic institution that emphasizes critical thinking, I am continually besieged by the idea, and the protest that all of my, that basically no good deed went unpunished.
Right.
But if you give up and then walk away and say, what
we must continue to strive.
Yeah,
to measure.
you just try to keep understanding what you might have misunderstood and questioning some of your assumptions, but say, look, I still believe that the right thing to do is to encourage this, and let's just take the criticism that's come in as part of what has to be taken into account in the next effort.
What decision isn't criticized at some point? All right. So final question. All right. You know what I do, right? I invest in people and companies, right? And so I'm always looking for the people that have this ability to think critically, to be self-critical, to be intellectually honest. You've now seen generations of these kids. How do you spot them? How do you like go, oh man, the critical thinking skills are off the chart?
Mm-hmm. In an educational setting, you can see it in their writing. You can see it in sort of laboratory conflict situations, a lot of which are athletic competitions or other kind of competitions. How do people deal with criticism? How do people deal with stress? Looking at the arts, particularly looking at theater, how do people deal with taking on someone else's character?
Right, putting themselves in someone else's mind.
Exactly, and how does the artist, the graphic artist, how are they taking what's in their heart and mind and putting it on a piece of it, putting it non-verbally? And I guess to some degree, ultimately, you come up with a judgment of how is this person balanced on the one hand and moving forward on their own terms in a way that is also consistent with how they will benefit from moving forward in the larger world. And that comes from, how do you do it? A lot of observation and a lot of interaction. And, when you're talking about companies, it would seem to me one of the questions is, how much do you know about your competitors? And tell me something good about each one of your competitors.
Yeah, I try to, I think that's for sure, that's part of our diligence process.
Yeah.
I try to get it from a conversation.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Right? I try to talk about something that has completely unrelated to
and I think
business
that makes a whole lot of sense.
Like, how do they think? How did they get there? What did they think about?
Right.
All right. Final question.
Okay.
You thought that was the final question.
No,
one more.
I never know it.
It is an easy one. Anything that I left out that is a glaring omission that you're like, oh man, how could you have talked about critical thinking and not talked about this?
No. I really, I think they've been great questions. It was great to sort of have a sense before of where this was going to go. Yeah. I'd be interested in the view of the omniscient observer. Did you think there were things that were missed, or?
It's pretty darn thorough.
We're in fact, for those who don't know, we're referring to the person who's doing the recording for us so kindly and has either the benefit or the unfortunate position of having to listen to every conversation that I have. Okay, Dr. Weiss. Let us end. I want to thank you very much for your time, for your insight. I believe it's a very, very important topic, and I've been searching for a long time to find somebody who, kind of really has their 10,000 hours on this. And I think not just for your class as they enter college, but for everyone navigating the world, the complex world, this is important. And I think you've done a part in helping them. So I want to thank you very much.
Well, that's great. And I've really enjoyed, the interplay and your questions and your responses. And I would sort of like to end with just recognizing that essentially we've been talking about, in this particular case, a curriculum that's evolved over the last 50 years, out of a intentional effort to incorporate some of the American educational assumptions, but in a multicultural context, initially European and now beyond. And, I came to the school with a mandate to deal with an international baccalaureate program that had been imposed by my predecessor on a faculty that was essentially impervious to having anything imposed on them, but particularly something different and demanding and whatever. But I just have to give him credit and the developers of this curriculum credit for now having, something like 5,000 or 6,000 schools around the world that have this curriculum as a part of their overall programs in 60 different countries.
And doing something to literally prepare kids, right,
Yeah.
for this.
Yeah. So thank you for letting me sort of rediscover the value of that.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
This has been Intangibles. As always, I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode. I'm your host, Steve Berg.